It's the Hero Show. Welcome to the Hero Show, everybody. Starring the imperturbable John Hersey and the irrepressible Andrew Bernstein. I am Andrew Bernstein, and you are indubitably John Hersey. How are you doing this morning, John?
I'm great. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm ready to rock and roll. We have people to discuss today whose courage is just off the charts. I mean, it's just staggering, and they show us that it's a sad story in part, a glorious story in part, but it's inspirational. It shows us the human potential, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And my heart is heavy today talking about this group. Of course, we're talking about the White Rose, a group of Munich students, University of Munich students, who tried to awaken the German conscience during the Nazi reign of terror in 1942 and 1943. And one of the definitely the pinnacle of courage, I think. There are others that are up there, but they're up there with the White Rose. These students were absolutely incredible in their courage, and it's just astounding what they did. So I can't wait to talk about it and honor these heroes today.
I know. It amazes me. And John, they're kids. These are college kids. So they're 18 to 22 or somewhere in that range. They're Aryans. So if they kept their head down and didn't say anything, the Nazis wouldn't harm them. And yet but they stood up for freedom and against the murdering policies of the National Socialist or Nazi Party, knowing this is 1942, 1943, like you said, midst of World War II, knowing that the most likely outcome would be a hideous death at the hands of the Gestapo, in the Nazi state, and they stood up for freedom and human life anyway. And it's an amazing story in and of itself. And I'm further amazed that they're not more widely known in this country. Country that historically has glorified heroes. They should be more widely known. So we'll do our part today to try and bring them the admiration and recognition that they deserve.
Yeah, they wrote a series of six leaflets that they distributed throughout Germany, and in these leaflets, they morally excoriated Hitler's regime, the National Socialists, for their racial hatred, their genocide against the Jews, the murdering of mentally disabled kids, and like you said, they could have just kept their heads down, but they couldn't. They couldn't because they had to stick up for what was right and what was moral, and they felt that moral impetus to speak out against the Hitler regime. And unfortunately, as you pointed out, they knew what the likely end game was, but they thought, as did the glorious Revolutionary War hero John Stark, who said, "Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils." They understood what the worst of evils was. They were looking it in the face, and they had to speak up. They had to say something. They had to try to awaken the German conscience, to get people to oppose, to do whatever they could, even if it was just to, sabotage some sort of rally or meeting, just to do something, because they understood that when people accept that sort of government, they are complicit in its atrocities. And they pointed this out again and again, as we'll see in their leaflets. Just incredible courage on their part.
Right. Right. And some people understand this at this very deep level. You mentioned John Stark, the New Hampshire Revolutionary General. I think also of Samuel Sharp, who was a black slave in Jamaica and led a slave uprising in quest of freedom, which the British squashed, brutally. And when they hanged Samuel Sharp, and before they hanged him, he said, "I'd rather die on yonder gallows than live a life of slavery." And some people just have they're on fire. They have this moral courage in service of what they know is good and right, and they would sooner, well, what's the expression? Die on their feet or die standing than live on their knees. And I got to tell you, John, and everybody, I'm a devout coward. I gotta publicly acknowledge this. One of the reasons why I love Heroes so much. And if I was an Aryan living in Germany, I think I would have kept my mouth shut. I don't think I could have done what the White Rose did. And by the way, before John, there's an expression in the military has, for bravery and valor above and beyond the call of duty, and I think these guys are it, because I don't morally blame German citizens. I get your point. I don't morally blame them, especially if they have children. Because the Nazis will kill them. The Nazis will kill them. They'll kill their children. So I don't morally blame them if they were too afraid to open their mouth. I blame the Nazis, for their brutality, and then credit the White Rose and heroes like that for their courage above and beyond the call of duty. It's just extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. So I guess we should. I guess, why don't you jump in and start telling the story? It's an amazing story.
Yeah. So I think it was in 1942, Hans Scholl met Alexander Schmorl, a Russian-speaking, I believe he was an immigrant to Germany. He spoke Russian fluently. And they began writing the first leaflet. And before long, they got others involved. Hans got his sister Sophie involved. When she found out about this leaflet, she was very interested in joining the movement. Interestingly, most of the members of the White Rose, or at least several of them, had been in the Hitler Youth in their childhood, and even to their father's great chagrin, because their father was one of these few liberally minded Germans who understood what the Nazis were all about and sort of saw the writing on the wall, or at least understood that this was no good. And so Hans and Sophie were both members of different Hitler Youth groups. They came to understand those ideas from the inside out, and then in time came to understand how evil those ideas were. And so Hans and Alexander Schmorl write the first leaflet. They begin to recruit others, and Hans and Schmorl and several others, you probably can recall the names better than I can, Andy, were also soldiers, and they served on the Western Front. Hans was a medical student at the University of Munich, and he had to do mandatory service as a medic in the field. And he saw what was going on. He saw evidence of the concentration camps, the brutal murder of women and children. And he saw that this wasn't the honorable regime that it was painted to be at home, and that many ordinary Germans were sold on it being, and knew that he had to get the word out about just how bad this was. In time, they also recruited, or they didn't really need to recruit, he volunteered, their philosophy professor, Kurt Huber, at the University of Munich, and began to put out these leaflets, which just absolutely pissed off the Nazi leadership, but they couldn't do anything about it because they couldn't find them. They were just quite good at hiding their tracks. And that was until, I believe it was February of 1942, around the time of the publication of the fifth leaflet. Prior to this, they had been quite successful. They distributed the leaflets to students in Hamburg and Stuttgart and Ulm, other cities in Germany, and were able to get the word out. They distributed it just by sending them to people in the mail. And, the cities also were dotted with public phone booths. So they would hide their leaflets in the phone books of these public phone booths. But yeah, so around the time of the fifth leaflet, I believe, is when things took a turn for the worst.
Yeah, right. And making matters even more extraordinary, John, Munich or München. This was the the headquarters of the National Socialist Party. This was that part of Bavaria was a hotbed of National Socialist sentiments, where the party started, where it originated from. So they were right in. I mean, they were right in the lion's den. I don't want to compare Nazis to lions. They were right in the snake pit. It's just a better comparison for the Nazis, but they were right in the snake pit. And I think we should. I think we should read excerpts from some of the leaflets. What do you think? So the audience has an idea of what these kids stood for.
Absolutely.
I just happened to
Prepare
have a
yourself.
copy. That's right, John. I just happened to have a copy of the Objective Standard, just by accident, in which somebody wrote, a brief essay on the White Rose, and we have some excerpts here. Here's from the first leaflet that they printed and widely distributed. Quote, "Isn't it true that every honest German is ashamed of his government these days? Who among us has any conception of the dimensions of shame that will befall us and our children when one day the veil has fallen from our eyes and the most horrible of crimes that infinitely outdistance every human measure, reach the light of day?" That was from their first leaflet, everybody. Now,
can I throw out another quote from that one?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
There's a line in there that I absolutely love. I'd love to share it. They write, "If the German people I have in parentheticals here because they said if they, but they were meant, if the German people are so devoid of all individuality, have already gone so far along the road toward turning into a spiritless and cowardly mass, then yes, they deserve their downfall." Now, as you said, the German people were as oppressed as some of the enemies and feared death, and so we can't condemn them with the fervor that these college students did. But they were in a very different position than we are today. They were attempting to ignite a revolution against Nazism, against National Socialism. And
Right.
I just love that they point out that these people were devoid of all individuality, and they were made to be so by force. That was part of the Nazis' reign of terror and means of dealing with the population there in Germany. Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Right. No. That's a good point. They forced collectivism on them brutally. Anybody who stood up for individual rights was dragged off to a concentration camp and, of course, murdered. And also by endless propaganda. I mean, there was endless propaganda, from 1933 when the Nazis came to power, National Socialism came to power. That the individuals have no rights. They have only obligations to the state. The state. The state comes first, foremost, and always, and everybody serves the state. And if necessary, you live for the state, you die for the state. And, we see, John, we did a show on the great John Locke a couple of months ago, and, the principle of individual rights in politics. Well, here we see in the National Socialist state, its antithesis. Here's Hegel's influence. The collective, the group, the state comes first, individual serves. So you're absolutely right. And what the White Rose was saying is the German people have had this beaten into them, both by propaganda and by brutal physical force, that they're nothing in and of themselves. They exist only to serve the state. Yeah, you're right. The second leaflet was even more vociferous because they got down to specifics. What you said before is true, because Hans Scholl was a medical student. He had served on the Western Front in France, and then he served on the Eastern Front in Poland. And on the Eastern Front, there was a huge Jewish population in Poland that the Nazis rounded up and annihilated almost all of them. And Hans Scholl and some of the others, I don't remember who the others were, who were medical students who also saw this. But I know you mentioned some of the that there were other members of the group: Willy Graf, Christoph Probst, Alexander. I don't know if the German is Schmorell or Schmorell, but along with Hans, Sophie Scholl, and the philosophy professor Kurt Huber. Hancho and one or two of the others were medical students who saw these atrocities on the Eastern Front, and they weren't shy about sharing what they said. Quote from the second leaflet: "Since the conquest of Poland, 300,000 Jews have been murdered in this country in the most bestial way. The German people slumber on in dull, stupid sleep and encourage the fascist criminals. Each wants to be exonerated of guilt. Each one continues on his way with the most placid, calm conscience, but he cannot be exonerated. He is guilty, guilty, guilty." Oh my God. I mean, these guys are on fire. I mean, they are so passionate. And you're right what you said before. They're in a different situation, much different situation than we are. They're trying to ignite the German people in revolution against the Nazis, and you can see the inflammatory rhetoric. Um, Actually, this essay in the Objective Standard. I mean, I was playing. Obviously, I wrote this, but here's a great quote. "Nor was the White Rose afraid to condemn Hitler directly. Quote: Every word that comes from Hitler's mouth is a lie." Unquote. Well, you can't be any more brutally direct than that. All right. And then John and everybody at the University of Munich, again, right in the snake pit of the concentration of National Socialist power. They painted on in bold letters on the walls at the University of Munich: "Down with Hitler, freedom, Hitler the mass murderer." I mean, wow! You just gotta salute. This is way above and beyond the Call of Duty. This is just extraordinary. Uh, and then of course they got caught, didn't they?
Yeah, while distributing this leaflet at the University of Munich, they decided that they were going to bring. It was Hans and Sophie Scholl. They decided they were going to distribute the leaflet at the university between classes while the students were in class and no one was around. And so they went into the university as a beautiful building with huge columns and a big entryway. And they go in and they're setting the leaflets down very quietly, very quickly behind each of the columns. And as they were leaving, they noticed that they had some more left. And they thought it would be a pity for them to go to waste. So they went to the second floor to drop some more leaflets. And they set some on the balustrade that overlooked this huge foyer, I guess you'd call it. And in an act of bravado and daring, Sophie Scholl, as she was walking away, decided to nudge the stack of leaflets out over the foyer, and they just come raining down as the students were leaving their classes. Unfortunately, that also alerted the janitor. I believe his name was Jacob Schmidt or Joseph Schmidt, and he grabbed them, brought them to the school's authorities, who then called the Gestapo, who arrested them and began to interrogate them.
Right. Yeah. The maintenance man or the janitor, unfortunately, I don't know if he was a member of the National Socialist Party or not, but at the very least, he was a Nazi sympathizer, and he certainly turned them in. And the trial was just a farce. I mean, the Nazi judge did not let the defendants speak on their own behalf. What kind? That's not even a sham of justice when the defendants don't get a chance to speak. But Sophie Scholl still shouted out, during the trial. I don't remember her exact words. Well, they're written in the essay there, but words to the effect that the war is lost. Why are you too cowardly? Why are you too cowardly to see that? You're trying to convince the Nazi hierarchy to make peace, come to terms with their enemies, which of course would stop the slaughter and the mass murder that the White Rose stood up against. But unfortunately, for thousands and thousands, maybe millions of innocent people yet to be murdered by the National Socialist regime, that didn't happen. So this is February 1943. They'd been speaking out against the Nazis courageously since the summer of 1942. It's amazing that they were able to survive for that long. But of course, they were convicted at the trial in February 43, condemned to death by guillotine, uh, by the most brutal manner possible. John, you want to relate to everybody what Hans Scholl's last words when he cried out as the blade was about to fall? I mean, it's really, again, another
Yeah.
amazing moment in the history of freedom. You remember what Hans?
Yeah, he said, "Es lebe die Freiheit, long live freedom," as the
Long
guillotine
live
fell.
freedom long live freedom as the guillotine blade is
Yeah,
either falling or is about to fall and decapitate him. So, wow, again, the courage
this
here,
is a
the courage
throwback.
here.
It brings you back to the French Revolution and just to the insanity that reigned so much earlier. It was just a retrogression back into the past. And you're right, it was a complete sham trial. It was later deemed illegal, and their murder was called a judicial killing. They weren't allowed to speak, but Sophie refused to be silenced, like you said, and she just threw the judge's reproach back at him. There's a beautiful movie called Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, and I think it's extremely well researched. I don't know if this particular line comes from the actual transcript. I've had some trouble finding the actual transcript, and a lot of this stuff is very difficult to find, and not enough has been said about the White Rose. But there, her last line to the judge and to the courtroom at large, which was just filled with Nazis, was, "Someday you'll be standing where I'm standing now." And that's exactly what happened. The world put the Nazis on trial.
Judgment at Nuremberg. Yeah, not Nazi war criminals. And of course, Eichmann, years later, Adolf Eichmann was captured by the Israelis in Buenos Aires, smuggled back to Israel, an amazing story in and of itself, and put on trial. I think that was early 1960s. Put on trial, convicted. Eichmann, of course, was one of the architects of the death camps, convicted and executed for war crimes in Israel. But anyhow, yeah, that's to come. But the White Rose, even though uh, the Scholl siblings were executed, one of the other members, I think was it Christoph Probst, I think, was executed with them in
It was.
February of '43. Yeah, and some of the other members were executed that in the fall, I think, on October of 1943. But the spirit of the White Rose lived on because other courageous Germans took up the cause. Friends of the Scholl siblings. Let me see. I have their names written down. Hans. I don't speak any German, but I won't get the pronunciations. Hans Liepelt and Marie Louise Jan. They they were friends of the Scholl siblings. They got hold of copies of the 6 leaflets, smuggled them into Hamburg, typed them up, and distributed them in Hamburg. This is in 1943, and of course they were later arrested. I think that same year because they'd been raising money for the widow of Kurt Huber, the philosophy professor who was an ally of these young students, who was executed by the Nazis. They were raising money for his widow, and somebody turned them in. So Liepelt and Jan were arrested by the Gestapo. Liepelt, he was condemned to death, and he was guillotined, and Marie Louise Jan was sentenced to, I don't know, like 12 years at hard labor. But their spirit lived on in another way also. There's another postscript to their story, isn't there? That's more successful and glorious.
Yeah, the German jurist von Moltke I believe his name was, and I also don't speak
Yeah,
German.
yeah.
But as you point out in your beautiful essay on the White Rose and the Objective Standard, he smuggled it out. What was it, to Scandinavia somewhere,
Yeah, through
and then
Scandinavia to
on to
Great Britain.
England.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the Allies printed up thousands and thousands of copies, right, and rained them down
Yes.
back on Germany. Take that. The idea
Yes.
lives on.
Like exactly. The Allies retitled the leaflet was a manifesto of the students of Germany, and just airdrop them over German cities and towns. Again, you know, pointing out to the German people that there were heroes among you who stood up against the Nazis, and the Nazis are going to get what they have coming to them. So maybe you want to join the resistance and get on the right side, the morally right side. This of this struggle, trying to do the Allies here trying to do the same thing the White Rose tried to do, stiffen the moral backbone of as many people in Germany as they possibly could to stand up to the reign of terror imposed by National Socialism. So the spirit of the White Rose lived on.
And speaking of moral backbone, Sophie Scholl was given the opportunity to uh, to sign a confession that damned the ideas that the White Rose stood for. This is what I understand from reading the transcript of this. And she turned that down. She decided to stand with the White Rose and stand with the ideas, knowing full well that she was about to be put to death. But her last words were, "The sun still shines." And it certainly shined the day that the Allies dropped their leaflets all over Germany.
Yeah, that's for sure. That is absolutely for sure. And it reminded me, again, their story needs to be more widely known. I mean, these are extraordinary heroes. Heroes take action in service of human life, right? They support life, not death, and often it requires extreme courage to stand up to the obstacles and the enemies of these life promoting values. So these are the White Rose does that abundantly. They're extraordinary heroes. So their story deserves to be much more widely known, especially in the United States, where the country is founded on the principles of individual rights and liberty. It reminded me when I was doing the research for that TOS essay on these heroes, John, that one of my favorite Ayn Rand essays, "The Inexplicable Personal Alchemy," where this was the late 1960s, when I think Brezhnev. Me too. So it's so touching when she's it was late 1960s. I think Brezhnev was in power in the Soviet Union. They were cracking down on whatever few liberties there might have been allowed in the years after Khrushchev denounced Stalin, and reimposing a brutal Stalinist regime. And you had these Soviet dissidents speaking out against the regime in Moscow, and Henry Kam, New York Times of all dishonest leftist rag. But once in a while they have an infectious fit of honesty or something. Anyway, he's telling Henry Kam, a beautiful article that the New York Times gave Ayn Rand permission to reprint large parts of it, talking about the courage of these Soviet dissidents. And it was one young man, I think early 20s, Vadim Delon, was that his name, who said to the judge, as the judge, the judge sentenced him to 3 years, in prison for arguing with the KGB, for arguing for freedom with the secret police. And Vadim Delon said to the judge in the courthouse, he said, "For 3 minutes on Red Square, I felt free. I'll gladly take you 3 years for that." You go, "Oh my God, they're going to stick him in a gulag?" Now they didn't chop off his head. the way the Nazis did. Even at that, he was lucky. Stalin would have killed them the same way, Hitler did the White Rose. But it's the same kind of spirit, that we were talking about at the outset. This inexplicable personal alchemy, that Henry Kam in the New York Times called it, that motivates, that he couldn't explain. I think we can. He couldn't explain what that inexplicable personal alchemy was that drove these heroes to stand up to tyranny, even though they knew the likely outcome was going to be, imprisonment in a gulag or execution, or some horrible fate like that. There's something inside them that just refused to remain silent. And this again, this is extraordinary courage. And speaking of being inexplicable, in that TOS essay in the White Rose, I mentioned, I think it was in February 1993, right? 50 years, the 50th anniversary of the execution of the Scholl siblings. Newsday, the Long Island newspaper, did a very nice tribute to the White Rose, which I'd like to see many more of. But the author, she recognized, she talked about how, this. Actually, why don't I just quote it? Right, I have the essay right here. Lillian Garrett Grogg memorialized these brave souls, saying, quote, this is from Newsday, "It is possibly the most spectacular moment of resistance that I could think of in the 20th century. The fact that 5 little kids in the mouth of the wolf, where it really counted, had the tremendous courage to do what they did is spectacular to me." Now, I don't know if I call them little kids, but I get her point. She was emphasizing how young, right? How young they are. They're how youthful they were. We said this before. They should have had their whole life in front of them. They're 22 years old or thereabouts. They should have had many years to come. But they stood up for freedom. They stood up for human life, and of course, were executed. And she's right. Lillian Garrett Grogg this is spectacular. But she goes on to say, where is that quote? She says, "I know that the world is better for them having been there, but I do not know why." Now that's interesting, isn't it, John? She's absolutely right. It's the world's better place for the White Rose being there. And again, it's similar to what Henry Kam had said 25 years earlier. I think it was in 1968, that New York Times piece. He called it the inexplicable personal alchemy. He couldn't explain it. She can't explain why the world's a better place, but I think we can. And I think we can explain, certainly in part, why the world's a better place, because of people like the White Rose and the Soviet dissidents Ayn Rand honored in her essay, The Inexplicable Personal Alchemy. Why is the world a better place? Because of these courageous individuals, John?
They show exactly the proper response to this sort of tyranny. They show what the height of courage that people are capable of. And this is relevant today. What were they fighting against? They were fighting against the regime that wanted to crush out their right to speak their minds. And we're seeing the same thing today, not primarily from politicians, but from the culture at large, from a heavily indoctrinated culture of critical race theory, of outright racial warfare. And there is a huge push today to silence dissent. And it's really scary. Right. It really is.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
We need to summon the spirit of the White Rose, or we may need to very soon, if we don't continue to speak up and question this trend. So, another reason why the White Rose is so relevant. Yeah.
Absolutely. The White Rose and the Soviet dissidents that Ayn Rand was honoring also. I mean, Why is the world a better place, Ms. Garrett Grove? Because they're heroes, and this is what heroes do. They promote human life in action, and they inspire the rest of us to be the best version of ourselves. That's why the world's a better place. They inspire the rest of us to be the best version of ourselves. And you're absolutely right. It is terrifying. This cancel culture. You and I are going to be canceled one day if the present trend continues the objective standard will be put out of business. The hero show, will be suppressed. There's not going to be anybody allowed to stand up against the socialist tyranny. Whether it's a national socialist version, or more likely, I think we're heading towards a communist version. Inspired more by Marx. But then again, the racism and the race war, they've reversed the contemporary American Marxists have reversed the favored and disfavored races, right? But nevertheless, there's a real racist race war Nazi element that the contemporary Marxists have combined with their class war, rhetoric and their class war ideology. So we're moving to maybe some kind of hybrid dictatorship, largely Marxist, but with this racist Nazi element, integrated into it. But either way, National Socialism, communism, either way, they completely stifle individual rights. They'll censor anybody who speaks up on behalf of individual rights. Maybe send us to prison or execute us. So what you said is absolutely right. We have to try. It's not funny. There's no reason to laugh, but we have to try to be like Paul Revere in a certain way. Wake up the conscience of contemporary Americans to channel the White Rose, to channel the spirit of the White Rose, the spirit of those Soviet dissidents, and speak out, because we have the inexplicable personal alchemy. We recognize the death on our feet is morally superior to life on our knees, and we're going to stand up and speak out in support of individual rights and liberty until our last breath. That's why the world's a better place, because of the White Rose and because of the Soviet dissidents. What they did in of themselves in support of liberty and human life, and what they do to inspire us to carry on that tradition.
Absolutely. There's one relevant quote here from leaflet 5 that I'd like to leave people with. And I think although it speaks to National Socialism, it's quite relevant today. They say, dissociate yourselves from the National Socialist gangsterism. Prove by your deeds that you think otherwise. A new war of liberation is about to begin. The better part of the nation will fight on our side.
Well said. Well said. The United States, freest country at its best, freest country of history, was instrumental in defeating National Socialism. Certainly was the main factor in defeating the Soviet Union and communism, because without American involvement in NATO and commitment to defend Western Europe, the Soviets, I think, would have swallowed up Western Europe. And here's a third. Those battles were external. Now the battle is internal against the socialist forces, and I mean full socialism here: communism, National Socialism. Where your life has been socialized. Your life belongs to society. Your life belongs to the state. Your life no longer belongs to you. It doesn't matter whether it's a National Socialist version or a communist version or a hybrid of the two. It's full socialism that is confronting us here in America. And we need to win the internal battle for individual rights and liberty, the way this great country won the external battles against both the National Socialists and the communists. So I think that's a wrap for the White Rose, unless you have any other tidbits of wisdom to share.
Well, what we'll do is we'll update the link in this show so that you can go and read the leaflets that they wrote. Our words can't replace theirs. just incredibly powerful and still relevant today.
Great. And I think we should. I think that's outstanding. I think we should sign off one. By again saying these heroes of the White Rose deserve much wider and deeper recognition for the reasons that we've been discussing. And I'm going to sign off with John and everybody and telling you, may you have a more heroic day, everybody, and a more heroic life.
Long live freedom.
Long live freedom, Hans Scholl said. Thank you.